In the heart of Chicago, on a busy corner in the neighborhood of Englewood, there once stood a building unlike any other in the city. To passers-by, it looked ordinary enough, a 3-story block of brick and timber with shops on the ground floor. But behind its walls, according to the newspapers of 1895, investigators uncovered secrets so disturbing that reporters struggled to find words strong enough for their headlines. They called it the Murder Castle. They said it held secret passages, gas chambers, a crematorium, chutes built to carry bodies straight to the basement. They said its owner, a handsome and well-spoken doctor named H. Holmes, may have killed as many as 200 people inside it. More than a century later, historians are still working to answer a simple but unsettling question. How much of that story is true? How much was invented by newspapermen chasing readers? And how do you even begin to separate a real killer from the legend that grew up around him? This is the story of H. Holmes, a man historians often call America's first well-documented serial killer, and it is also the story of how quickly fact can curdle into folklore when the public wants a monster. Was Holmes truly the architect of a 200-victim killing machine, or was he something narrower and, in its own way, just as chilling, a gifted conman whose real crimes were bad enough, without embellishment, but who became a canvas onto which an anxious, fast-changing country projected its darkest fears about strangers, cities, and the price of progress? To understand how a man like Holmes could operate for years without being caught, you first have to understand the America he lived in. The late 1800s were a period of extraordinary transformation. The Civil War had ended barely 15 years before Holmes arrived in Chicago, and the country was rebuilding itself at a dizzying pace. Railroads stretched across the continent, connecting towns that had once been isolated by weeks of travel. Factories multiplied in every major city, pulling workers off farms and out of small towns and into crowded urban centers, looking for wages and opportunity. This was the age of industrialization, an era when steel, steam, and electricity were reshaping everyday life faster than most people could process. It was also the era in which the modern life insurance industry was taking its first real shape in America, with companies competing aggressively to sell policies to a public that had never before had access to this kind of financial product, and with very little regulation governing how claims were verified. That gap between a booming, trusting new industry and the almost complete absence of oversight would turn out to be one of the most important tools in Holmes's criminal career. It was also an age with very little of the infrastructure we now take for granted in daily life. There was no national system for tracking missing persons. Police departments were local, poorly funded, and often more concerned with property crime and public order than with methodically investigating a person who simply stopped writing letters home. Background checks did not exist in any recognizable form. A man could invent a new name, a new profession, even a new wife, and travel a few hundred miles to start over with almost no one the wiser. Since there was no shared record system connecting one city's police department to another's newspapers, meanwhile, we're fighting for circulation in an increasingly competitive market, engaged in what historians now call the era of yellow journalism, where dramatic, emotionally charged stories were prized over careful verification, and sensational crime stories sold papers by the hundreds of thousands. This combination, weak institutional oversight, a highly mobile population, a young and exploitable insurance system, and a press hungry for shocking material, created exactly the kind of environment in which a predator with charm and patience could thrive for years without drawing serious suspicion. Chicago itself was a particular kind of magnet during these years. The city had rebuilt itself after the Great Fire of 1871 with astonishing speed, and by the 1880s it had become one of the fastest growing cities on earth, a hub of meatpacking, manufacturing, and finance, its population swelling with immigrants and migrants from rural America alike, all drawn by the promise of industrial wages. Then, in the early 1890s, Chicago won the right to host the World's Columbian Exposition, a massive World's Fair planned for 1893 to celebrate 400 years since Columbus's voyage to the Americas. The fair promised to draw millions of visitors from across the country and around the world, and it delivered, becoming one of the most attended events in American history. Up to that point, hotels, boarding houses, and rental rooms were suddenly in enormous demand, and the neighborhoods around the fairgrounds swelled with newcomers looking for lodging, for work, for a fresh start in a booming city. It was, quite literally, an environment where thousands of strangers were arriving in Chicago at once, many with no family nearby to notice if they went quiet. Englewood, the neighborhood where Holmes had already established himself, sat several miles from the fairgrounds, close enough to benefit from the crowds without being swallowed by them. This was the world Holmes moved into, and it is important context, because much of the myth around him later claimed he preyed specifically on fairgoers inside his building. As we will see, the documented evidence for that particular claim is thin. But the broader environment of the fair, a city bursting with transient strangers and weak record-keeping, absolutely shaped the conditions that allowed a man like Holmes to operate. So who was H. Holmes before he became a name that still echoes in true crime circles today? He was born Herman Webster Mudgett on May 16, 1861, in the small town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire. His family was respectable by the standards of rural New England, not wealthy but stable, and by most accounts young Herman was an intelligent, even gifted child, one who excelled in school and showed an early aptitude for reading and reasoning far beyond his years. Biographers and later psychological profilers have pointed to a strict, sometimes harsh upbringing, including a demanding father, and some accounts describe an early fascination with human anatomy, reportedly triggered by a frightening encounter with a skeleton at a doctor's office when he was a boy, an experience some later writers speculated pushed him toward, rather than away from, the study of the human body, as though he resolved never again to feel powerless in the presence of death. Whatever the precise origin, Mudgett showed real academic ability and pursued a path toward medicine, eventually enrolling at the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, from which he graduated in 1884. It was during his medical training that the first documented pattern of fraud in his life appears. Mudgett is known to have obtained cadavers, sometimes through the school's own supply and sometimes through other means, disfigured them to make them appear to be the victims of accidents, and then used those bodies to file fraudulent life insurance claims, collecting payouts on policies taken out under invented identities. This scheme reveals a great deal about the man he would become. Even before he had killed anyone that historians can confirm, he had already learned to see the human body as a tool for financial gain, and he had already shown a willingness to manipulate the growing, still relatively unsophisticated life insurance industry of the era for profit, and to do so with a clinical detachment that unsettled even some of the classmates who worked alongside him. His personality, as described by nearly everyone who encountered him throughout his life, was magnetic. He was described as strikingly handsome, with piercing blue eyes, impeccable manners, and an easy, confident charm that put people instantly at ease, the kind of presence that made strangers trust him within minutes of meeting him. One employee who worked for him later recalled that Holmes used to joke about paying a lawyer to keep him out of trouble, but that in reality it was always his own courteous, audacious charisma that pulled him through difficult situations. He was also, by every account, a compulsive liar and a serial bigamist, marrying at least 3 times, in 1878 to a woman named Clara Lovering, in 1887 to a woman named Myrta Belknap, and in 1894 to a woman named Georgiana Yoke, all without ever legally divorcing the wives who came before, and in each case presenting himself to his new bride as a respectable, unattached professional. He abandoned his first wife and their young child not long after graduating medical school, and by 1885 he had adopted the name H. Holmes, borrowing the surname from a respected Chicago family, and relocated to the city's Englewood neighborhood to begin the next chapter of his life. In Englewood, Holmes found work at a pharmacy owned by a woman named Elizabeth Holton, whose husband had run the store before falling ill. When Mrs. Holton's husband died, Holmes offered to buy the pharmacy, and shortly afterward, Mrs. Holton herself disappeared. Holmes explained to neighbors that she had moved away to live with relatives in California, a story that satisfied casual curiosity at the time, but that historians now regard as almost certainly false. She was never heard from again, and many researchers consider her Holmes's likely first Chicago victim, though because no body was ever found and no direct evidence survives, her fate remains formally unconfirmed, a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Holmes's career. With the pharmacy now fully under his control, Holmes set about building something far larger just across the street. And it is this building, more than anything else, that would eventually make his name famous and infamous across the world. Beginning around 1887, Holmes started construction on a large 3-story structure at the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets. Publicly, he described it as a mixed-use building, with retail shops on the ground floor and apartments above, and later, as the World's Fair approached, he began advertising the upper portion as a hotel for visitors, sometimes calling it the World's Fair Hotel. The construction itself became notorious in the neighborhood for how strange it was. Holmes constantly hired, and then abruptly fired contractors and laborers, often accusing them of shoddy work and dismissing them before they could complete their assigned sections, frequently without paying them in full, a habit that conveniently saved him a significant amount of money in wages, while also ensuring that no single crew ever worked on the building long enough to understand its full layout. Because of this constant turnover, very few workers, if any, understood the complete layout of the building, and Holmes himself appears to have been the only person who fully grasped how the interior connected together, since he changed the plans so frequently that even the tradesmen who had been there for months found themselves confused by rooms and passages they had never seen before. This is a documented, verified fact, and it is worth pausing on, because it is also the seed from which the wildest legends later grew. Newspapers, writing in the aftermath of his arrest, described the building as a labyrinth of more than 100 rooms, filled with doors that opened onto brick walls, staircases that led nowhere, windowless chambers, secret gas lines that Holmes could supposedly control from his own bedroom to asphyxiate guests at will, sliding trapdoors, and a basement outfitted with a dissection table, vats of acid, a stretching rack, and even a crematory oven for disposing of bodies. These images have become the defining visual of the Holmes story, repeated in books, documentaries, and dramatizations for well over a century, and reproduced so many times in illustrated newspaper diagrams of the era that many readers came to accept them as simple, established fact, rather than as speculation. But when historians have gone back to primary sources, court records, and contemporary building inspections, the picture that emerges is considerably less theatrical, even as it remains genuinely disturbing in its own right. According to Adam Selzer, a Chicago historian who has spent years researching primary documents related to the case, the building's third floor, the portion Holmes had advertised as a hotel, was in fact never finished, never furnished, and never actually opened to paying guests. It appears the hotel concept was largely a pretext, a story Holmes told suppliers, investors, and contractors to justify ordering enormous quantities of furniture and materials on credit that he had no intention of ever paying for. The building did contain some hidden or windowless rooms, but rather than torture chambers, the documented evidence suggests these spaces were primarily used to conceal furniture Holmes had acquired fraudulently, hiding it from creditors who came looking to repossess what he owed them. A scheme so effective that a company representative bribed a janitor before finally discovering that an entire room's worth of furniture had simply been walled up behind a false partition. There is no reliable physical evidence that the building contained a functioning crematorium, and claims about an elaborate network of secret gas-controlled murder rooms appear to trace back largely to sensationalized newspaper reporting, rather than to anything investigators actually documented at the scene. This does not mean the building was innocent. Holmes did use it as the site of at least some of his crimes, and its unusual, ever-shifting layout was absolutely a deliberate choice that served his purposes, both for defrauding creditors and for isolating the people who lived and worked there from outside scrutiny. But the popular image of a purpose-built torture factory, an image that has shaped a century of books and films, is now understood by serious historians to be substantially exaggerated. A case where the true story and the tabloid story diverged early and never fully came back together. We now move into the heart of what can actually be documented about the people Holmes is believed to have killed, and this is an area where it is especially important to separate confirmed fact from disputed or later invented claims, because the gap between the two is enormous. At the height of the sensational coverage following his arrest, newspapers speculated that Holmes may have murdered as many as 200 people, a number that has stuck in popular imagination ever since, and still appears in many retellings of his story today. Historians who have carefully examined the surviving evidence, however, arrive at a dramatically smaller and more sobering figure. Adam Selzer, whose research is widely regarded as the most rigorous work done on primary sources in this case, states that there are approximately 9 victims that can be confirmed with reasonable historical confidence. Holmes himself, shortly before his execution, confessed in a widely publicized statement to 27 murders. a confession that made headlines around the world. But that confession quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Several of the people Holmes named as victims were subsequently found to be alive and well. One of the most striking examples is a woman named Kate Durkee, whom Holmes claimed to have murdered inside the building. Shortly after the confession was published, Durkee herself issued a public statement from Omaha, declaring that she had never been murdered by Holmes or by anyone else, and was very much alive. This single episode illustrates something crucial about Holmes as a source. He was, in the words of one writer, not only a murderer but a serial liar who seemed to enjoy encrusting his own story with legend, embellishing his crimes for dramatic effect. Even as he sat awaiting execution, likely at least in part because a newspaper syndicate had reportedly paid him a substantial sum for his confession, giving him financial incentive to make the story as sensational as possible. So who were the victims that historians do consider reliably documented, based on employment records, family testimony, and consistent disappearance patterns, rather than on Holmes's own unreliable claims? Among the earliest are Julia Smith Connor and her young daughter Pearl. Julia's husband, Alexander, had come to work for Holmes as a bookkeeper and at the pharmacy's jewelry counter, and Julia herself became romantically involved with Holmes. When Alexander discovered the affair, he left town, abandoning Julia and Pearl, who continued living in Holmes's building. Around Christmas of 1891, both mother and daughter vanished. Holmes gave conflicting accounts over the years, at times denying any involvement in their deaths, and at other times claiming that Julia had died as the result of a botched abortion he performed himself, with Pearl's death following afterward. What actually happened to them has never been definitively established, though most historians consider it very likely both were killed. Not long after, in 1892, a young woman named Emmeline Sigrand came to work in the building and formed a close, possibly romantic relationship with Holmes. She disappeared before the year's end. Around the same period, another young local woman, Edna Van Tassel, also vanished, and some researchers consider her a possible additional victim, though the evidence connecting her disappearance directly to Holmes is less certain than in other cases. In early 1893, a woman named Minnie Williams moved to Chicago and began working for Holmes, and the two eventually married. Though, as with his other marriages, this one was not legally valid, given his prior undissolved unions. Williams owned property in Fort Worth, Texas, and Holmes convinced her to sign that property over to him, later transferring the deed to his accomplice Benjamin Pitezel. Her sister, Anna Williams, sometimes called Nanny, later came to visit, and both sisters disappeared later that year. It is worth noting explicitly here what investigators at the time were actually able to confirm versus what remained rumor. In nearly every one of these cases, no body was ever recovered, and no witness ever came forward with direct testimony to an act of murder. What investigators could establish was a consistent pattern: a woman or a family entering into a close personal or business relationship with Holmes, often after signing over money, property, or insurance benefits to him, and then vanishing without a trace, with Holmes offering an ever-shifting series of explanations for their absence, telling neighbors and relatives at various points that his secretary had simply gone to visit family and decided to stay, that his fiancée had secretly eloped with another man, or that a young woman in his care had died during a medical procedure he had tried and failed to keep quiet. This pattern of documented disappearance, combined with financial benefit to Holmes, is what leads modern historians to treat these cases as likely murders, even in the absence of physical remains. But it also means that, strictly speaking, the physical proof required for a modern murder conviction was never obtained for any of these individuals. The one set of killings for which overwhelming, physical, courtroom-tested evidence does exist involves a man named Benjamin Pitezel and 3 of his children, and it is that case, more than any other, that ultimately brought Holmes's career of violence to an end. To understand the Pitezel case, we need to step back and look at the financial crimes that were the true engine of Holmes's criminal life. Whatever his body count, Holmes was, first and foremost, a swindler, and an extraordinarily prolific one. Throughout his time in Chicago, he ran a dizzying array of overlapping scams. He ordered massive quantities of furniture and goods on credit from suppliers such as the Toby Furniture Company, promising payment on delivery, and then simply never paid, hiding the merchandise in the very hidden rooms that later fueled the murder castle legend. He took out insurance policies on people close to him, sometimes with their knowledge and sometimes without it, positioning himself as the beneficiary, a tactic he had already perfected years earlier with a cadaver scheme from his medical school days. He operated under a rotating cast of false identities across multiple states, which allowed him to default on debts in one place and simply reappear under a different name somewhere else. Since there was no unified system to connect his aliases together, he committed bigamy at least 3 times over, which itself served a practical financial function, since it allowed him to access the assets, property, and trust of multiple women without any of them being aware of the others. By the time the World's Fair opened in 1893, Holmes had become deeply enmeshed in a business relationship with Benjamin Pitezel, a carpenter and small-time criminal Holmes had hired. After placing a newspaper advertisement, Pitezel, despite his own struggles with alcohol and petty crime, became Holmes's closest and most trusted accomplice, involved in several of his schemes over the following years, functioning almost as a criminal apprentice who trusted his mentor completely, a trust that would ultimately cost him everything. In 1894, the two men devised what they believed would be their most lucrative scam yet. Pitezel would fake his own death, using a substitute cadaver to convince a Philadelphia insurance company that he had died in a laboratory explosion, allowing his family to collect a $10,000 life insurance payout, an enormous sum for the time, which the two men planned to split. Pitezel relocated to Philadelphia under a false identity to set up the scheme, but Holmes had no intention of splitting anything. Rather than staging a fake death with a substitute body as planned, Holmes murdered Pitezel for real. Forensic evidence later presented at trial showed that Pitezel had been rendered unconscious, likely with chloroform, and that the chloroform had actually been administered after his death rather than before it. Evidence investigators believed was intended to make the scene look like a suicide in case Holmes was ever questioned. Holmes then collected the insurance payout by convincing Pitezel's widow, Carrie, that her husband had genuinely died as planned, and that they needed to continue the ruse to secure the money. It was in the aftermath of this murder that Holmes made the decision that would ultimately doom him. Rather than allow Carrie Pitezel to reunite with her children, Holmes told her he needed to take 3 of them, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, on the road with him, ostensibly to reunite them with their father, who Carrie still believed was alive and in hiding. In reality, Holmes was using the children as a kind of insurance policy of his own, keeping them just out of reach of their increasingly desperate mother while he decided what to do with them. He shuttled the children across state lines, sometimes housing them in lodgings only a few streets apart from one another without letting them meet, treating the entire situation, in the words of one historian, almost like a game whose rules only he understood. One biographer later writing that he possessed the children entirely and seemed to revel in that possession. Eventually, over the following weeks, Holmes killed all 3 children. He later confessed to forcing Alice and Nellie into a large trunk, drilling a hole through its lid, and running a hose from the hole to a gas line in order to asphyxiate them. Afterward, burying their bodies in the cellar of a rental house in Toronto, Canada, he mutilated one of the girls, cutting away a deformity on her foot, apparently in an attempt to make identification more difficult. Howard, the youngest, was killed separately in a rented house in Indianapolis, where his remains were later found badly burned inside a stove, with investigators also finding evidence that Holmes had visited a local pharmacy for drugs and a repair shop to sharpen knives in the days before the boy's death. The unraveling of Holmes's crimes began almost by accident, through the collapse of the very insurance fraud scheme he thought would make him rich. Suspicion first fell on Holmes, not because of any missing woman from Chicago, but because a fellow criminal, a train robber named Marion Hedgepeth, whom Holmes had met in prison during an earlier, unrelated arrest, tipped off authorities about the insurance scheme after Holmes failed to pay him the cut he had promised in exchange for a lawyer referral used to help plan the fraud. This tip set off a chain of investigation. Holmes was first arrested in Boston in November of 1894, initially on a relatively minor charge, and authorities there quickly realized they were dealing with something much larger. As investigators in Philadelphia began piecing together the true story behind Pitezel's death, it became clear this was not simple insurance fraud, but murder, and further digging revealed the 3 missing Pitezel children. The case was assigned to a Philadelphia police detective named Frank Geyer, and Geyer's dogged, methodical work over the following months became one of the most celebrated pieces of detective work of the era. Later published as his own book on the case, which District Attorney George Graham of Philadelphia would describe as one of the most remarkable stories of the age. Searching through evidence taken from Holmes at the time of his arrest, Geyer discovered a tin box containing letters the Pitezel children had written to their mother. Letters Holmes had collected but never mailed. Using clues within these letters, along with hotel and rental registries, Geyer painstakingly retraced Holmes's movements across several states and into Canada, following a cold trail city by city, hotel ledger by hotel ledger, for weeks at a time, with no guarantee any of it would lead anywhere. In July of 1895, this work led him to a rented house in Toronto, where he located the buried, badly decomposed bodies of Alice and Nellie Pitezel in the cellar. Continuing his search, Geyer traveled on to Indianapolis, where he found the burned remains of Howard Pitezel inside the chimney of a house Holmes had rented under a false name. This discovery transformed the case from a story of insurance fraud into a national sensation, and it was in the wake of these grim findings, as reporters descended on Chicago, looking for anything else Holmes might have been connected to, that his old Englewood building came under intense scrutiny for the first time, searched thoroughly by police, and picked apart in exhaustive detail by journalists. And it was in the pages of the era's most sensational newspapers, filling in gaps in the known facts with lurid speculation that readers found impossible to look away from, that the legend of the murder castle first began to take shape, with illustrated diagrams of imagined torture devices circulating in print long before any serious investigator had verified their existence, and public reaction across the country ranged from horror to an almost feverish fascination, with crowds reportedly gathering outside the Englewood building simply to look at it. Holmes's arrest and prosecution unfolded quickly once the Pitezel murders were established. He was extradited to Philadelphia, where he was formally charged with the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. Holmes reportedly welcomed the transfer, believing, likely correctly, that he would face a lighter outcome there than if he had been sent to Texas to face an outstanding charge of horse theft, a crime that was treated with particular severity in that state at the time. His trial began in Philadelphia in the closing days of October 1895, and it was, by every account, a media sensation, drawing coverage from newspapers across the country and reportedly around the world, with reporters filling the courtroom benches each morning and telegraph wires carrying updates to readers hundreds of miles away by that same afternoon. The trial itself was surprisingly brief, lasting only about 6 days, a reflection of just how strong the physical evidence against Holmes was in the specific matter of Pitezel's death. Prosecutors presented forensic testimony regarding the chloroform found in Pitezel's body and the timing of its administration, along with a wealth of circumstantial evidence tying Holmes to the insurance scheme and to Pitezel's movements in the days before his death. Holmes attempted to serve as his own attorney for portions of the proceedings, reportedly hoping his personal charm, the same charm that had won over so many victims and business partners over the years, might sway the jury in his favor. It did not. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. It is worth being precise here about what Holmes was actually convicted of, since this is another place where the historical record and the popular legend diverge. Despite his reputation as a serial killer responsible for dozens or even hundreds of deaths, the murder of Benjamin Pitezel was the only killing for which Holmes was ever formally charged and convicted in a court of law. Every other death attributed to him, including those of Julia and Pearl Connor, Emmeline Sigrand, Minnie and Anna Williams, and even the 3 Pitezel children, was never the subject of a separate trial, largely because his conviction and death sentence in the Pitezel case made further prosecution unnecessary from a legal standpoint. This is an important distinction for understanding how history has come to know Holmes. Much of what we attribute to him rests on confession, circumstantial pattern, and later investigation, rather than the kind of courtroom-tested proof that exists for the Pitezel murder alone. Holmes was sentenced to death by hanging, and in the months between his conviction and his execution, his case only grew more sensational in the public eye. It was during this period that he gave his infamous confession, published by a newspaper syndicate that reportedly paid him a considerable sum for the exclusive rights to his story, in which he claimed responsibility for 27 murders across several states, describing his crimes in dramatic, often theatrical language, including the now famous line that he was, in his own words, born with the devil in him. As already discussed, this confession contained significant fabrications, most strikingly, the case of Kate Durkee, who was alive and furious to find her name attached to a murder that had never happened. Historians today generally view the confession less as a reliable factual record and more as Holmes's final performance, a man who had spent his entire adult life constructing false narratives for personal gain, continuing to do so right up until the moment of his death, whether for money, for notoriety, or simply because manipulation and storytelling had become second nature to him. Holmes was executed by hanging on May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, at the age of 34. Public interest in the execution was intense, with crowds gathering outside the prison from the early morning hours and newspapers publishing detailed, almost hour-by-hour accounts of his final hours, his last meal, his demeanor on the walk to the gallows, and his final words. According to several historical sources, Holmes was reportedly deeply anxious about the possibility that his own body might be exhumed after burial and used for dissection or sold to a medical school. The same grim marketplace in human remains that he himself had exploited during his years running insurance frauds involving cadavers. Whether or not this fear was the primary motivation, Holmes's remains were, at his own specific request, encased in cement inside his coffin, and buried in a grave dug unusually deep, a final, almost darkly ironic act of self-preservation from a man who had shown so little regard for the bodies and lives of others. In the years that followed, persistent rumors circulated, claiming that Holmes had somehow escaped execution entirely, bribing officials to hang another man in his place, rumors that speak more to the mythic status he had already achieved in the public imagination than to any credible evidence, and that were formally investigated and put to rest in the year 2017, when Holmes's remains were exhumed at the request of his own descendants and confirmed through forensic and dental examination to be genuinely his, closing more than a century of speculation and quietly confirming that for all his talent at disappearing into false names and invented lives, in the end even H. Holmes could not escape being exactly who the historical record said he was. This brings us to one of the most important parts of understanding the H. Holmes story properly, the ongoing careful work of separating confirmed history from exaggeration and legend. As we have already touched on throughout this account, there is a real and significant gap between what can be documented and what has simply been repeated so often that it has come to feel like established fact. On the side of confirmed history, we know that Holmes was a serial bigamist and a prolific financial fraudster who defrauded suppliers, insurance companies, and business partners for years. We know he built an unusually laid-out commercial building whose confusing structure served, at minimum, to hide stolen furniture and to keep outsiders from fully understanding what was happening within its walls. We know, with a very high degree of confidence, that he murdered Benjamin Pitezel and Pitezel's 3 children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, crimes that were established through forensic evidence, detective work, and his own eventual confession. We know that at least several other people, including Julia and Pearl Connor, Emmeline Sigrand, and Minnie and Anna Williams, disappeared after close personal or financial entanglement with Holmes. Disappearances that most historians believe represent additional murders, even though definitive physical proof was never recovered. On the side of exaggeration and myth, the picture looks quite different. The claim that Holmes killed as many as 200 people appears to have no solid documentary basis and is generally traced by researchers to sensationalized accounts published years after his death, including a widely read book from 1940 that historian Adam Selzer identifies as a major source of the inflated figure. The image of the building as a fully realized torture factory, complete with secret gas chambers controllable from Holmes's bedroom, an operational basement crematorium, and a functioning stretching rack, does not hold up against the physical evidence available from the period, and appears to have been substantially invented, or heavily embellished by newspapers competing for readers in the immediate aftermath of his arrest. There is no credible evidence that Holmes murdered fairgoers who wandered into his building during the World's Columbian Exposition, despite this being one of the most enduring and dramatic elements of his popular legend. The idea of a serial killer hiding in plain sight among the crowds of a World's Fair. Even the confession Holmes gave shortly before his execution, often treated in retellings as a definitive account of his crimes, is now understood by historians to be a mixture of genuine admission and outright fabrication, complicated further by the financial incentive he had to make his story as dramatic as possible for the newspapers paying for it. This does not mean Holmes was somehow a lesser criminal than his reputation suggests. The confirmed facts alone describe a man who defrauded, manipulated, and killed for financial gain over the course of nearly a decade, including the deliberate murder of 3 children, but it does mean that the version of the story most people know, shaped by more than a century of sensational retelling, sits somewhere between documented history and elaborate legend, and untangling exactly where that line falls remains an active area of historical research even today, with new archival discoveries still occasionally reshaping small details of the timeline. Given how thoroughly Holmes's story has been exaggerated over the decades, it is worth asking why his case has remained so enduringly fascinating. Why, more than 130 years later, he is still one of the most discussed criminal figures in American history. Part of the answer lies in timing. Holmes's crimes coincided almost exactly with the World's Columbian Exposition, one of the most celebrated events in American history, a fair that showcased electric lighting, groundbreaking architecture, and a vision of a gleaming, modern future for the entire world to see. The juxtaposition of that dazzling, hopeful spectacle with a predator operating quietly just a few miles away created an almost irresistible narrative contrast, one that later writers would come to describe using the phrase "the devil in the White City," referencing both the fair's nickname and Holmes's crimes. This phrase became the title of Erik Larson's best-selling non-fiction book, published in 2003, which wove together the story of the fair's construction with the story of Holmes's crimes, and did, more than perhaps any other single work, to bring this case to a mass modern audience, introducing millions of readers to a story that had largely faded from public memory over the preceding decades. That book has since inspired numerous documentaries, podcasts, and ongoing efforts to adapt it for film and television, keeping the case in active circulation within popular culture, alongside earlier works such as Harold Schechter's detailed non-fiction study of the case, and later, graphic novel and academic treatments that have each tried, in their own way, to reconstruct what actually happened inside that Englewood building. Beyond the fair connection, Holmes's case also holds a particular place in the history of American criminology, because he is frequently described as the country's first well-documented serial killer, a case study that predates the term serial killer itself by many decades, giving later criminologists, true crime writers, and podcast hosts an early, almost foundational case to return to again and again when exploring questions about predatory behavior, charisma, and the failures of early law enforcement systems. Modern, academic work on offender psychology, victim selection, and the social conditions that allow predators to hide in plain sight often gestures back to Holmes as an early, if imperfectly documented, template, precisely because his case sits at the intersection of so many forces: a fast-growing anonymous city, an unregulated insurance industry, a sensationalist press, and a charming, intelligent offender who understood how to exploit all three at once. His story also continues to resonate because of what it reveals about the limitations of the era's institutions, the ease with which a mobile population, absent background checks, and understaffed local police forces allowed someone like Holmes to operate for years. A set of conditions that feels distant from modern life in some ways and uncomfortably familiar in others. And finally, there is the simple, uncomfortable pull that true crime as a genre has always exploited. The desire to understand how an apparently charming, intelligent, successful-seeming person could also be capable of such calculated cruelty. A tension at the center of the Holmes case that no amount of historical correction seems able to fully dissolve. More than a century after his death, the story of H. Holmes remains suspended between documented history and enduring legend. A case where the confirmed facts are disturbing enough on their own, and yet where the myth has grown so large and so persistent that it has, in many ways, outpaced the truth it was built on. Historians continue to comb through court records, newspaper archives, insurance filings, and correspondence, slowly refining what can and cannot be said with confidence about a man who spent his entire adult life blurring the line between fact and fiction for his own benefit. Separating the real Holmes from the murder castle of newspaper legend may never be entirely possible. Not fully, not with the gaps left by more than 100 years, and by a killer who lied even in his final confession. But that incompleteness, strangely, may be part of why the case continues to fascinate historians, true crime writers, and audiences around the world. A reminder that even history's most notorious stories are rarely as simple, or as fully known, as they first appear. Perhaps that is the real lesson buried beneath more than a century of trapdoors and torture chambers that were never actually there. that the truth about H. Holmes does not need embellishment to be disturbing, that a charming, well-educated man, swindling and murdering his way through a booming, anonymous city is unsettling enough on its own terms, and that the myth, however entertaining, has in some ways done a disservice to the 9 or so people whose real, undramatized deaths first set this whole legend in motion, people who deserve to be remembered as more than footnotes in someone else's carefully constructed story.